Mark's fist connected with Todd's jaw, a sickening crunch echoing in the office as Todd crumpled to the plush carpet. My breath hitched, my face burning with a shame so raw it felt like a brand. Everyone stopped, coffee cups suspended, eyes fixed on me. Mark didn't even glance my way. "Get out, Sarah," he said, his voice flat. "I'm done with you." I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, the mattress still firm and familiar beneath me. A stark contrast to the shifting ground of my life. Outside, the autumn wind rustled the dry leaves in the old oak tree, a sound I'd known since I was small. My fingers, still thin and marked with a faint kitchen scar from learning to peel potatoes too young, twisted the gold band on my left hand. 4 years of marriage to Mark, a solid, dependable man, had vanished in the last 3 months, dissolving like sugar in hot coffee. The ring felt heavy, a cold anchor on a sinking ship. The scene from last week still played in my mind, vivid and sharp. Mark's voice, a low rumble of pure fury, cut through the stunned silence of the office. "I think you should leave now," he'd said, his words directed at me, not at Todd, who lay crumpled on the carpet near the water cooler. The sight of Todd's expensive suit rumpled, his face a bruised mess, had done little to stir pity in me, only a burning shame. A realization of the irreversible damage. 4 months before, things had been different. Mark and I had been married, quietly content in our small, tidy house on the edge of town. He was an engineer, dependable, methodical, the kind of man who fixed things without being asked and remembered small details. He was my rock, my safe harbor, his presence a constant, comforting weight. We ate dinner together most nights, watched television, and sometimes talked about the future, about maybe expanding the garden or taking a trip to the Great Lakes. His love was a steady current, always there. Then came the new job at Morrison & Blake. It was a step up, a consulting role that promised more challenge and better pay. I remember the excitement, the new clothes I bought, the careful planning. On my first day, the office hummed with a different kind of energy than I was used to. That was when I met Todd. He was the CEO, younger than I'd expected, with a charisma that filled the room. His firm grip when we shook hands felt surprisingly strong, his blue eyes sharp and assessing. He wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than my first car, and his touch, when he guided me past a crowded desk, lingered for just a moment too long on my elbow. I dismissed it as a power gesture, a sign of his confidence. "We're glad to have you, Sarah," he'd said, his voice smooth, a practiced warmth behind it. "You've got a reputation for getting things done." His compliments, casual as they were, made me feel seen, like my quiet efforts had finally been recognized. I found myself twisting my wedding ring, a nervous habit I hadn't realized I still had, a small, unconscious declaration of my existing tether. The early weeks blurred into a rhythm of late meetings, intense brainstorming sessions, and long hours. Todd was often there, his presence a constant, encouraging hum. There were casual touches, a hand on my shoulder as he leaned over a project, a brush of fingers as we reached for the same pen. Then came the work texts, late at night, initially about deadlines, then evolving into observations about the day, shared jokes, a vague question about my weekend. I rationalized it as professional rapport, a necessary closeness required for a high-stakes consulting environment. It was nothing more, I told myself, a part of building a strong working relationship. The company gala was held at a downtown hotel, a shimmering affair with chandeliers and hushed waiters. Mark was working late, as he often did, absorbed in a complex project. "You go ahead, hon," he'd said, kissing my forehead. "Tell me all about it when you get back." I spent an hour meticulously preparing, selecting a dress I hadn't worn since our honeymoon, telling myself it was purely for professional pride, a reflection of my new, elevated position. Todd was waiting near the entrance, a glass of champagne already in his hand. His gaze, when it landed on me, was intense, direct, and completely stripped of professional distance. "Sarah," he murmured, stepping closer. "You look stunning. Absolutely breathtaking." The words felt like a warm current, washing over me, making me forget the coldness of the evening air. I pushed away the fleeting image of Mark, sitting alone in our living room, probably reading a technical manual. I took the champagne glass Todd offered, the cool stem, a small comfort in my hand. 3 drinks later, the city lights twinkled like scattered diamonds from the rooftop terrace. The air was crisp, the music a distant thrum. Todd's voice, a little softer now, broke the comfortable silence. "Does Mark truly appreciate you, Sarah?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. "Mark's wonderful," I said, the words sounding weak, even to my own ears. He moved closer, his shoulder brushing mine. Our hands, resting on the cold railing, brushed too. A shock of electricity shot through my body, sharp and undeniable. An awakening I hadn't known I needed. "I should go," I whispered, the words barely audible against the soft drone of the city. But I didn't move. Not when he leaned in, his breath warm against my ear, nor when his lips found mine. The kiss was raw, urgent, filled with a fire and urgency that ignited something wild and forbidden deep within me, something I had kept locked away for too long. After the gala, nothing was ever the same. The kiss on the rooftop had been a dam breaking, unleashing a current I hadn't known existed within me. Days bled into weeks, each one a careful choreography of deceit and exhilaration. Todd's office, once a place for strategic discussions, became a clandestine chamber. He would summon me for project reviews, his tone crisp and professional over the intercom. The door would click shut, and within minutes, the careful facade would crumble. The reviews quickly escalated into passionate encounters, the urgency of our stolen moments, a potent aphrodisiac. His hands on me, the smell of his cologne, the whisper of his words, it all felt dangerously alive. We met in other places too, always dim, always discreet. Hotel bars with their plush velvet seating and hushed conversations became our preferred stage. We'd sit across from each other, a half-empty glass of wine between us, ostensibly discussing business, but under the table, our feet would find each other, playing a silent, secret game of footsie, the electric touch sending shivers up my spine. Every text from Todd, even a simple emoji, made my heart race, a sharp, physical thump against my ribs. The thrill of it all, the forbidden nature, consistently overpowered any lingering thought of consequences. I became an expert liar, a skill I'd never imagined possessing. Late meeting, I'd tell Mark, my voice steady, my eyes meeting his without a flicker. Client dinner ran long. The excuses flowed easily, a practiced cadence. My absences became frequent, always plausible, always just vague enough to avoid detailed questions. The ease with which the lies formed on my tongue was frightening. It was like watching a stranger speak, a smooth, confident woman I barely recognized. Mark, bless his trusting nature, never questioned me. "You're really excelling at work, aren't you, Sarah?" he'd say, his voice warm with pride. "I'm so proud of you." His praise was a physical ache, a dull throb in my chest. But I buried the shame deep, pushing it down under the intoxicating rush of stolen moments with Todd. Each lie I told, each secret meeting, stretched the distance between Mark and me, turning it into something unbridgeable, a widening chasm I felt myself falling into. About 2 months into the affair, Mark surprised me. I walked in the door after a late meeting, which had, in fact, been an afternoon spent tangled in Todd's sheets to find him dressed in his good shirt. "Thought we could have a nice dinner out," he said, a hopeful smile on his face. "At the Olive Tree, your favorite." The Olive Tree was our restaurant, the place where he'd proposed, where we celebrated anniversaries. We sat in our usual booth, the soft red checked tablecloth between us. He ordered my favorite pasta, remembering the exact sauce. "I miss you, Sarah," he said, reaching across the table to cover my hand with his. His touch, once so comforting, now felt alien, heavy with the weight of my deceit. His genuine love, so clear in his eyes, made me feel physically ill. The pasta, usually so delicious, tasted like ash in my mouth. I mumbled an excuse about feeling unwell and rushed to the bathroom. Leaning over the toilet, I dry heaved, the guilt a hot, metallic taste in my throat. My phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out, my fingers trembling slightly. It was Todd. "Thinking about you tonight. That black lace you wore last week drives me wild." I stared at the words, a cold knot forming in my stomach. A perverse thrill mixed with profound self-loathing. With shaking fingers, I deleted the text, clearing my mind of the image. I splashed cold water on my face, took a deep breath, and returned to the table, forcing a smile. Mark was animated, telling me about a new project at work, his words flowing with an enthusiasm I hadn't noticed him possess in a long time. I nodded, feigned interest, but all I could think about was Todd, about the heat of his gaze, the forbidden thrill. The guilt was a constant, heavy weight, settling in my bones, yet like an addict chasing a fix, I found myself unable to stop. The high was too strong, the escape too alluring. Mark, despite his trusting nature, wasn't entirely oblivious. He started noticing small things. My phone, once left carelessly on the counter, was now always locked, always in my purse. I'd take calls in the other room, my voice hushed. Sometimes, after I'd come home from a late meeting, he'd catch me in the hall, and his eyes would linger on my hair, mussed in a way that wasn't quite right, not from a simple office chair. He didn't say anything, but I could feel his gaze, a quiet pressure, a silent question hanging in the air. One night, as we sat on the couch watching a rerun, Mark turned to me, his brow furrowed with a concern that made my stomach clench. "Is everything okay at work, Sarah? You seem different lately." His hand found mine, his thumb stroking my knuckles. The touch felt like a burning brand. "Just stressed," I mumbled, pulling my hand away to adjust a cushion. I kept my gaze fixed on the television screen, where a sitcom family was laughing too loudly. "The new position is demanding, you know. Lots of pressure." He shifted closer, putting an arm around me, pulling me gently against his side. The scent of his familiar, comforting aftershave filled my nostrils. "Maybe you should look for something else then," he suggested, his voice soft, full of genuine care. "Your happiness is more important than any job, you know that. We'll figure it out." I am. His words, his unwavering goodness, felt like a physical weight, pressing down on me. I pulled away again, mumbling something about needing to check an important email. The lie felt flimsy, transparent even to me. As I walked to the kitchen, leaving him alone on the couch, the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. That's when I knew I had to end it. The affair. The lies. All of it. The decision came suddenly, sharp and clear, like waking from a long, disorienting fever dream. The intoxicating haze lifted, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. The next morning, I walked into Morrison and Blake with a resolve I hadn't felt in months. My hands shook slightly as I pushed open the door to Todd's office, but my voice was steady. He looked up from his computer, a faint smile playing on his lips, already assuming my presence was for something else. "We need to talk," I stated, closing the door firmly behind me, the click echoing in the suddenly quiet room. "This has to end." After relevantly, he leaned back in his expensive leather chair, his familiar smirk returning. "Sit down, Sarah," he suggested, his tone patronizing. "Let's discuss this like adults." I remained standing, my knuckles white as I gripped the back of a visitor's chair. "There's nothing to discuss," I declared, my voice gaining strength. "I'm giving my 2 weeks' notice." The smirk vanished, replaced by a hard, calculating expression. His eyes narrowed. "Don't be dramatic, Sarah," he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its polished charm. "We both know you're not going anywhere." "I'm serious, Todd," I insisted, pushing back against his condescension. "I love my husband. What we've been doing, it's wrong." The words felt liberating, a heavy weight lifted with each syllable. He stood then, slowly, his height suddenly imposing. He walked around his desk, stopping a few feet from me. "That boring engineer?" He scoffed, his tone filled with disdain. "Come on, Sarah. You deserve more than that. You deserve excitement. Passion." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a seductive whisper. "You deserve me." A fresh wave of anger, cold and righteous, washed over me. "Don't talk about Mark like that," I snapped, my voice rising. "He's twice the man you'll ever be." Todd's face darkened, the charm completely gone. His eyes glinted with something cold and menacing. "Is that so?" he said, his voice dangerously low. "Well, let's see how he feels about your extracurricular activities then." My stomach clenched, a cold knot forming in my gut. "Are you threatening me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He smiled then, a chilling, humorless smile. "I'm simply stating facts, Sarah," he said, his voice smooth and calm, utterly devoid of warmth. "You're making a mistake. Think about your career. Think about what people will say. In that moment, I finally saw Todd clearly. His magnetic charm, the confident aura, it was all a thin veneer. Beneath it lay something cold and calculated, his confidence nothing but arrogance. He was not the exciting, passionate man I had deluded myself into believing he was. He was just a bully. "I'm leaving, Todd. Accept it." I turned on my heel and walked out of his office, not waiting for a response. The door clicked shut behind me. A sense of lightness, of having shed a heavy burden, settled over me. But the relief was short-lived. A faint tremor of fear, like a distant rumble of thunder, began to stir in my chest. 3 days later, the ordinary rhythm of our evening was shattered. The doorbell rang, a startling sound in the quiet house. Mark was home early, a rare occurrence. His work shift ending unexpectedly. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for a simple stir-fry. The comforting rhythm of the knife against the cutting board. I heard Mark open the door. Then, a voice that made my blood run cold, smooth and confident, cut through the domestic quiet. "Evening, Mark. Mind if I come in?" It was Todd. My heart hammered against my ribs. "No. Not here. Not now. I have some business to discuss with Sarah." Todd continued, his tone dangerously calm. My blood ran cold, a sudden icy rush. I dropped the knife, the clatter on the counter echoing in the sudden silence of the house. I rushed to the living room, a desperate, sickening lurch in my gut. But it was too late. Todd was already inside, standing in the middle of our living room, the space that had always felt safe and mine. He was accepting a glass of water from Mark, who looked bewildered, holding the glass out like a peace offering. "Nice place," Todd said, his eyes sweeping across the room, taking in the worn armchair, the bookshelves filled with Mark's engineering textbooks, the framed photos of our life together. There was barely concealed disdain in his voice. "Very cozy. I confined to us void times. Something more called. They know that is other. What are you doing here?" I managed to ask, my voice a thin, reedy sound, trying to keep it steady, to project an air of control I definitely didn't feel. My hands were shaking. Todd turned to me, his smile not reaching his eyes. Those eyes, once so alluring, now glinted with pure, malicious intent. "Just thought we should clear the air before your departure," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. He paused, letting the words hang in the air, his gaze flicking to Mark, who was still holding the glass of water, his brow furrowed in confusion. After all, Mark deserves to know why his wife is relieving her job. Mark's head snapped toward me, his confusion deepening into something more. "Sarah?" he asked, his voice low. "What's he talking about?" Todd chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Oh, hasn't she told you?" His voice was pure poison, laced with a triumphant cruelty. "About our little—" He let the word trail off, a suggestive ellipsis hanging in the air, allowing Mark's mind to fill in the blanks. Mark's face drained of all color, turning a pasty white. The glass of water in his hand trembled, a few drops spilling onto the carpet. He understood. The dawning horror in his eyes was sickening to witness. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me, encompassing me completely. The room seemed to spin, the familiar walls closing in. Todd just stood there, smiling, a cruel, triumphant smirk, clearly enjoying the destruction he had wrought, savoring every moment of our agony. Mark's gaze, once full of trust, moved slowly from Todd to me, his eyes wide with a dawning, terrible realization. The question was silent, but it echoed in the room, louder than any shouted accusation. "Is this true, Sarah?" Mark's voice was barely a whisper, broken, fragile, a sound that tore through me. I couldn't speak. My throat was tight, constricted, as if a hand had reached in and squeezed it shut. Tears welled in my eyes, hot and stinging. But I couldn't release them. I was trapped, caught in the devastating wreckage of my own lies, frozen in the glare of the terrible truth. Then, Mark's voice, suddenly sharp and clear, cut through the agonizing tension, a sound of absolute finality. That's when I hit him. Mark stood over Todd's crumpled form, his fists still clenched, knuckles red, chest heaving with the effort of suppressed rage and raw pain. The silence in the room was deafening, save for the ragged sound of his breathing. "I think you should leave now," Mark repeated, his voice low and guttural. The earlier words he'd spoken in Todd's office now imbued with a bitter, irreversible finality. He wasn't talking to Todd. He was talking to me. But his gaze remained fixed on the man on the floor. Todd scrambled awkwardly to his feet, a dark stain of blood blooming on the side of his expensive suit jacket. He looked stunned, disoriented. Mark took a step forward, his eyes burning. "Get out," he snarled, the word a raw, animalistic sound. Todd didn't need to be told twice. He fled, stumbling slightly, without another word. The sound of the front door slamming shut, echoing through the house. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the living room. It pressed in from all sides, thick and tangible, broken only by my own ragged, shaky breaths. The air was charged, thick with the aftermath of violence, and the sudden, brutal unveiling of truth. Mark turned his back to me, his posture stiff, unyielding, a solid wall between us. He walked slowly, deliberately, into the kitchen, the sounds of his movements unnaturally loud in the quiet house. "Mark, please, let me explain," I pleaded, the words catching in my throat, hot tears streaming freely down my face, blurring my vision. My voice was hoarse, desperate, a stranger's voice. He went to the sink, picked up a glass, and filled it with water. His movements precise, methodical. He didn't look at me. His voice, when it came, was flat, devoid of emotion, like stones grinding together. "There's nothing to explain, Sarah." I glanced down at my left hand, at the gold band on my finger. My wedding ring, once a symbol of promise and connection, now felt like a cold, mocking weight, a heavy accusation. "How long?" Mark finally asked, still not looking at me, his back a solid wall between us. The question was a low rumble, barely audible, but it cut through the silence like a knife. 3 months. I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "It was a mistake, Mark, I swear. A terrible mistake." The lie, or at least the simplification, felt hollow even as I said it. He finally turned then. His eyes, usually warm and familiar, were like chips of ice, sharp and piercing, devoid of any recognition. "A mistake?" he repeated, his voice rising, edged with a horrifying incredulity. "You call this a mistake?" He gestured broadly, a bitter, sweeping motion that encompassed our entire home, the quiet life we had built together, the years of shared dreams, the small comforts. "I don't even know who you are anymore, Sarah." The raw, undisguised pain in his voice was a physical blow, worse than any punch. It left me breathless, gasping for air, the weight of his heartbreak crushing me. This moment, a sudden fracture in what seemed a solid life, reminds us that even the most carefully constructed worlds can shatter in an instant. Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. The next few days were a blur of icy silence and quiet, cutting accusations. The air in our small house, once filled with the comfortable sounds of shared life, was now heavy with unspoken words and palpable grief. Mark moved into the spare room, taking only a few essentials, leaving behind a profound emptiness. Our home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a hollow shell, each room echoing with the ghosts of what we had been. I tried to talk, to apologize, to beg for understanding. I would follow him from room to room, my voice a desperate pleading whisper. But Mark's wall was impenetrable. He would look through me, his eyes distant, unseeing. Sometimes, he'd just nod curtly, a gesture of dismissal that cut deeper than any harsh word. "I loved you, Sarah," he said one evening, his voice hollow, broken, as he sat on the edge of the spare room bed, staring at a blank wall. "I trusted you with everything." His words were not an accusation but a statement of undeniable, devastating fact, and they pierced me to my core. I resigned from Morrison and Blake a day later. The email was terse, professional. The coveted career, the promotion, the sense of being seen at all, now tasted like bitter ash in my mouth. There was no joy, only a profound sense of loss. Not just for the job, but for the path that had led me there. Word travels fast in a small Midwestern town. Whispers followed me through the grocery store aisles, in the coffee shop, at the park. Averted gazes, sudden silences when I approached. My friends, once so close, became uncomfortable. Some slowly distanced themselves, unable to reconcile the Sarah they knew with the woman who had done what I did. Their strained smiles, their hurried goodbyes, were as sharp as any rebuke. My parents, pillars of the community, were heartbroken. My mother called, her voice choked with tears. "How could you do this, honey?" she asked. The question, laced with a profound disappointment, that felt heavier than anger. "What were you thinking?" I had no answers for her, only a crushing sense of shame. I felt utterly alone, the full weight of my choices closing in on me, suffocating me with their consequences. Then came the meeting with the lawyer. Mark told me about it one morning, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, as he stood in the kitchen, making his own coffee. He said the papers would be ready next week. The word divorce wasn't spoken, but it hung heavy in the air, a final, unyielding verdict. The life I had built, brick by brick, with Mark. The quiet evenings, the shared dreams, the comforting predictability, was crumbling, irrevocably broken. In my desperation, I tried to contact Todd. I needed to hear his voice, to understand, to somehow salvage something from the wreckage. But he had blocked my number. My emails went unanswered. He vanished as completely as he had appeared, leaving me to face the storm alone, a solitary figure in the wreckage of my own making. He was gone, a phantom, his promises and charm revealed as fleeting illusions. "He used you, Sarah," Mark stated one night, standing in the doorway of the spare room, his face etched with a pain so deep it made my chest ache. It wasn't a question, but a cruel, undeniable truth. And the shame of it, of being so easily manipulated, of sacrificing everything for such a hollow liaison, was overwhelming. It became a constant, suffocating companion that clung to me every waking moment, a bitter taste that lingered on my tongue. Weeks stretched into a month. The quiet hum of my parents' house was a stark contrast to the lively hum of my former life. I found myself living back in my childhood bedroom, the same faded wallpaper, the same old desk where I used to do my homework. It was the very room where the story had begun, twisting my wedding ring on my finger, now a room of silent judgment. The ring, no longer on my left hand, lay cold and stark on my dresser, catching the morning light. It was a constant, tangible reminder of lost dreams, broken promises, and the life I had so carelessly thrown away. Every time I saw it, a fresh wave of grief washed over me. I took a new job, a mundane position at a local accounting firm. It was far from the prestige and intellectual allure of Morrison and Blake. The work was simple, repetitive, a stark contrast to the high-stakes consulting I once craved. Each day felt like a penance. Every morning, I woke with a profound, aching sense of regret. It was a physical weight on my chest, a cold hand squeezing my heart. The memories of what I had sacrificed, the trust I had betrayed, played on a loop in my mind. Sleep offered little escape. I saw Mark occasionally in town, at the hardware store, where he used to buy supplies for his weekend projects, at the local diner, where we'd sometimes grab breakfast. He looked thinner, older, the lines around his eyes deeper. There was a sadness in his gaze that twisted my gut, a quiet resignation that hurt more than any anger he could have shown. He never acknowledged me. His gaze would pass over me, distant, unseeing, as if I were a ghost, a stranger. I was invisible to him, and that invisibility was a deeper wound than any harsh word. I learned through the grapevine that Todd faced no real professional consequences. He simply moved on, untouched by the devastating fallout he had caused in my life. The injustice of his escape stung, a bitter taste in my mouth, yet I recognized my own complicity. I had walked into the fire, willingly. I had played the game, and I had lost. His callous indifference was a reflection of my own blindness. Slowly, painfully, I tried to mend fences with my parents. It wasn't easy. My mother's disappointment was a constant ache. I confessed to them, pouring out my deeper remorse, trying to articulate the confusion and emptiness that had led me down that path. They listened, their faces etched with a mix of sorrow and weariness. My mother, ever practical, gently suggested counseling, an idea I initially resisted, my pride still raw, but eventually, in my profound loneliness and desperation, I accepted. I started writing in a journal, filling page after page with my thoughts, my guilt, my desperate attempts to understand my own motivations. The ink bled into the cheap paper as I poured out the chaos in my mind. Why did I do it? I scribbled repeatedly, the question echoing endlessly in the quiet of my room, a desperate plea for an answer that never came. The familiar Midwestern landscape outside my window, once a source of comfort and stability, now seemed to reflect my inner desolation. The endless fields, the wide, flat sky. They stretched out, vast and empty, mirroring the landscape of my soul. I felt like a stranger in my own skin, stripped bare of my former identity, lost and adrift in a world that no longer recognized me. I began therapy, sitting across from a quiet woman named Dr. Evans, slowly unpacking the complex layers of my choices. It was a painstaking process, like sifting through debris after a storm. We talked about a yearning for external validation, a fleeting desire for excitement that had clouded my judgment, and a pervasive sense of being unseen, even in a loving marriage. The quiet revelations were stark, uncomfortable truths. I realized that Todd's allure had been a mirage, a clever projection of my own unmet, unaddressed emotional needs. He hadn't filled a void. He had merely exploited it. The excitement I'd chased was cheap, fleeting, leaving nothing but emptiness and destruction in its wake. One afternoon, sitting at my old desk in my childhood bedroom, I wrote a long, heartfelt letter to Mark. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. I knew I wasn't entitled to that. It was an expression of profound remorse, a confession of my deepest regrets, and a stark, unwavering taking of full accountability for my actions. I detailed the emptiness I'd felt, the poor choices I'd made, and the selfish reasons behind them. I didn't expect a reply. I simply needed to articulate the raw, unvarnished truth of my regret. For him, but mostly for myself. I sealed it without a return address and dropped it in the mailbox. Mark, still struggling with his own pain, eventually found and read the letter. It didn't erase the deep wounds I'd inflicted, but it softened the hard edges of his anger, replacing it, slowly, with a quiet, weary sorrow. He began to process his own grief, the understanding dawning that my devastating actions, while unforgivable in their immediate impact, had stemmed from a flawed human being, not a monster. It was a small shift, but a significant one, in the landscape of his healing. I started volunteering at a local community center, helping with after-school programs. The work was simple, the children's needs immediate and uncomplicated. It was a small, fragile sense of purpose, a way to focus beyond my own suffering. I began to rebuild my life, one small, honest step at a time, away from grand gestures and false promises, away from the glittering, hollow attractions that had almost consumed me. I learned to sit with my guilt, a constant companion that no longer needed to consume me. It was a stern, honest teacher, reminding me of the consequences of my choices, but it no longer paralyzed me. It was a part of me, a scar, but not the whole story. One quiet evening, during a long walk, I found myself passing our old house. It was twilight, the porch light already on. Another family lived there now, their lives unfolding within the walls that once held ours. I heard the faint sound of children's laughter drifting from the open windows, innocent and joyful. A sharp pang of what could have been hit me, a bittersweet ache that settled deep in my chest. It was a recognition of loss, a quiet acceptance of the past. The understanding dawned then. Paying the price wasn't a single dramatic event, a sudden punishment. It was a slow, continuous process of living with the truth, day in and day out, of rebuilding a life from the wreckage, piece by painful piece. It was the quiet acceptance of consequence. Morality isn't about being perfect, I mused to myself, walking on as the last of the light faded from the sky. It's about how you face your imperfections, how you choose to live with the mistakes you've made, and how you learn to carry the weight of your own humanity. A year had passed since the affair was brutally exposed, a lifetime in its wake. The seasons had turned, the leaves had fallen and grown back, then fallen again. I now lived alone in a modest, two-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, a place that was mine, and mine alone. My life was simpler, quieter, stripped of its former complications, its false glamour. I was no longer the woman who chased fleeting thrills, driven by an unexamined restlessness. I was a more reflective, somber individual, marked by my past, etched by its lessons. My relationship with my parents had slowly, painstakingly healed. It wasn't the easy, unconditional bond it once was, but something deeper, built on honesty, on my difficult confessions, and on their quiet, earned forgiveness. We talked less about my future, and more about the simple rhythms of the present, finding comfort in the shared silence. I occasionally heard news of Mark through mutual acquaintances, fragments carried on the wind. He was doing well, rebuilding his own life, a life now undeniably without me. There was no grand reconciliation, no dramatic twist of fate, just the quiet, mundane continuation of lives irrevocably changed. Two separate streams flowing away from a shared origin. I often reflected on paying the price. It wasn't just losing Mark, or my job, or my reputation. It was the enduring loss of trust, the home we had built, and a fundamental part of my own identity. The woman I had been, the woman Mark had married, was gone, and I understood now the true, profound meaning of Mark being my safe harbor, the quiet security, the steadfastness, the unwavering presence I had so recklessly abandoned for a glittering, hollow illusion. I found a quiet solace in the predictable rhythms of my new life. The unchanging Midwestern landscape outside my window, with its vast fields and wide, open sky, offered a grounding, calming presence. It reminded me that life, like the land, endures, reshapes itself, and always, eventually, moves forward. I acknowledge the enduring scars, the ghosts of what might have been, that would forever walk with me. A part of my story, a testament to the choices I had made. One ordinary afternoon, pushing a cart through the produce aisle of the local grocery store, I saw Mark. He was standing near the apples, examining a red delicious, with the same careful attention he used to give a broken engine. Our eyes met briefly across the colorful displays. A sudden, unexpected connection. There was no anger in his gaze, no accusation, just a shared, knowing glance, a silent acknowledgement of two people who had once loved deeply and were profoundly wounded by each other. We exchanged a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of quiet acceptance, a silent truce between former adversaries. Then, we both turned away, continuing with our separate, irrevocably changed lives, the grocery carts rattling softly on the linoleum floor. I understood then that true forgiveness, if it was ever to come, had to start deep within myself, earned through difficult, painful self-knowledge, through the long, quiet process of owning my mistakes. I carried the weight of my past, a heavy, permanent burden, but I also carried the fragile hope of a future, one built on truth, humility, and the quiet, enduring lessons learned in the heartlands, where the land and its people never forget. A year had passed since the affair was exposed, a lifetime in its wake. I now lived alone in a modest apartment, my life simpler, quieter, stripped of its former complications. I was no longer the woman who chased fleeting thrills, but a more reflective, somber individual, marked by my past, etched by its lessons. My relationship with my parents had slowly, painstakingly healed, built on honesty and quiet, earned forgiveness. I occasionally heard news of Mark through mutual acquaintances. He was doing well, rebuilding his own life, a life now undeniably without me. There was no grand reconciliation, no dramatic twist of fate, just the quiet, mundane continuation of lives irrevocably changed. I often reflected on paying the price. It wasn't just losing Mark, or my job, or my reputation. It was the enduring loss of trust, the home we had built, and a fundamental part of my own identity. I understood now the true, profound meaning of Mark being my safe harbor. The quiet security, the steadfastness, the unwavering presence I had so recklessly abandoned for a glittering, hollow illusion. I found a quiet solace in the predictable rhythms of my new life. The unchanging Midwestern landscape, offering a grounding, calming presence. I acknowledged the enduring scars, the ghosts of what might have been, that would forever walk with me. A part of my story, a testament to the choices I had made. One ordinary afternoon, I saw Mark at the local grocery store. Our eyes met briefly across the aisles, no anger, no accusation, just a shared, knowing glance. It was a silent acknowledgement of two people who had once loved deeply and were profoundly wounded by each other. We exchanged a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of quiet acceptance, and then turned away, continuing with our separate, irrevocably changed lives. I understood that true forgiveness, if it was ever to come, had to start deep within myself, earned through difficult, painful self-knowledge. I carried the weight of my past, but also the fragile hope of a future built on truth, humility, and the quiet, enduring lessons learned in the heartlands.